Good evening, everyone, and thank you to everybody who has made the effort to come here to the headquarters and to end their day with a roundtable on this new book, which I'm showing you here. So they say Violence extrême, enquêter, secourir, juger, République, etc. Jean-Hervé Bradol and Claudine Vidal will speak about the contents of the book, what it represents for us. But I simply want to relocate it in the written production of MSF with the distance of the 50 years of the existence of MSF by reminding you that this title, Extreme Violence, corresponds to the very circumstances of the creation of MSF, because these are the two major massacres that inspired people to engage with MSF, our founders. These two big massacres was the Biafra War and the repression of eastern Pakistan, which, in passing, it was often presented in MSF's documents as a natural disaster. Several hundreds of thousands of deaths were deplored in 1970 in eastern Pakistan, but it was due to a cyclone, indeed. But these 300,000 deaths were added several thousand other deaths with the ferocious repression, to the point where we talked about genocide, and we are still investigating this topic. And so these were the two major massacres. It wasn't a war and a natural disaster in the beginning, but all existence of MSF have been accentuated by this kind of event, since from the beginning MSF has asserted, has a certain tropism for the violent situations, not exclusively. The wars are not the only field of action for MSF, but is one of the most important. So I'm not going to go into all of the conflicts of extreme violence we have been confronted by, but I would say that it took us some 20 years, that is to wait till the beginning of the 1990s, for MSF to attempt to begin to get interested in the circumstances, in the analysis of contexts. And that was due to the fact that a new player appeared on the scene, and that is the military humanitarian contingents and various armies who dabbled in humanitarian work up until the end of the Cold War. That was the beginning of the series, Populations in Danger. But I think there were six or seven versions. But it was our first attempt to face up to these situations, not simply from a medical angle and the witnessing the atrocities or a call for reactions in a more appropriate way, but to get into an attempt to understanding the causes and analysis of those root causes. And so it has been marked by geopolitical considerations, which are tributary to the international political theory. But it was a part of this framework that we started working in. The first volume devoted to violence, which was on the Congo. And so we have the two authors of this book they're here, they work there in the Congo. But this time it's really a matter of getting into a series of analyses of situations of extreme violence concerning Rwanda. I don't need to remind you of the Tutsi genocide in 1994, sorry. But also the follow-up of that is what we've also studied. I'm not going to go into details because it's Claudine and Jean-Hervé which are going to go into more detail. But in the DRC and Syria as well, And so I want to underline the fact not only is it a matter of extreme violence, but it's also a matter of extremely controversial situations, not in a global way, but in each of these situations, the controversies were born concerning the magnitude or the nature of extreme violence that we were able to observe. And nobody denies extreme violence, but certain people discuss about the status or the real existence of certain parts of this violence. For those who are following the MSF's history, they were able, the latest controversy was concerning the massacre committed in the DRC by the Rwandan army and the militias, which were also on site at the time. So this book, which deals with the subject, but the subject, the primary subject, is to fuel the polemics, but to look at it from various angles on particularly extreme situations in these three countries. And so I think this book is very interesting. It's the really first attempt to analysis and explore and study the extreme violence from several different angles. And that is what I wanted to stress here today. The real subject of the book is looking from several different angles at extreme violence. But I think it's one of the most successful publications we've had over the past 20 years, and I hope that everybody, after this roundtable, I hope will get more interested in the topic. And after that, it's a matter of delving into the book to be able to appreciate all its subtlety. So I'll give the floor now to Jean-Hervé, who is going to talk about Syria, and Claudine will follow. Thank you, Rony. Detail. I am replacing Hakim ce soir, who is the director of communication, but who had to go off to Yemen in a rather sudden way, an unplanned way. So I've been asked to talk about the contents of the three papers dealing with Syria in the work. I'm going to start with Abdulkarim Ezkayez, who is a Syrian doctor. He and Ammar Sabouni are young Syrian doctors who assume their responsibilities, that is, they remain as members of the government, and so immediately they were involved, and they were pilloried by the bombing by the Syrian army. And from the very first days in these war zones, they experienced an attack by small hospitals were attacked that were there to take in the injured and the casualties. And I wasn't surprised. I'm sorry. I said that they were part of the government. That's my mistake. Of course they weren't. They were there as aid givers to people wounded by the bombing by the Syrian government. When they did carry out care for the demonstrators opposed to the regime, and the second phase for them, that it wasn't just this kind of persecution that was done, they had to face it, but a veritable bombing campaign, and which struck the health facilities in which they were working. And they say in their article they had to think about working in these circumstances and remaining operational. It was the real challenge. The work was facilitated by an improved means of communication and the website, specialized website for the opponents to the regime. And there are also exchanges with Twitter and Facebook. And it's true, I was surprised when I first consulted Twitter when I was with Hakim in Syria. And it's Nathalie Roberts which opened my Twitter account for me. And you, on the thread that you were able to communicate more rapidly. Real information, in fact, to know if the local military commander on whom we depended for our security was to what coalition he was a member of, and what his attitude was to humanitarian organizations in these political space, which are always organized and connected with certain coalitions. And then the forum of WhatsApp also played an important role for disseminating information. And they reported on the incredible level of violence of the health facilities and care and places for care. The Ministry of Health, who mandated the WHO to repertory these attacks. Between 2011 and 2019, they recorded 105 attacks against health facilities, and about 1,000 caregivers were killed during these bombardments between 11 and 19. And so these young doctors assumed their responsibility, while others fled the country. I'm not casting judgment here, it's just the reality. These two doctors had to organize from down to up the replacement of the Ministry of Health and the replacement of care centers, but also for hiring medical personnel in the area, and also to carry out communication and to do advocacy, to be able to find a workspace for work, and to organize all of this work, that is canvassing the doctors that remained on site and listing them to be able to know whom they could go to, and also to try and establish salaries for these health workers. But in the first weeks of where our colleagues could work without being in danger, the civil war, the people felt that it wouldn't last very long. The regime was convinced it was going to end fairly soon, but they rapidly had to become obsessed with being paid properly to be able to survive, quite simply. And the regime hardened its stance and criminalized the caregivers. And in these attacks against the health facilities and personnel, it was called the militarization of health. And that's how our colleagues called what they were experiencing, which led them to do more than what we usually do. And what we usually do is that we combine. We will label a vehicle with a logo, for example, like the Red Cross, to make sure that people understand that we are medical people and are supposed to protect us. But our colleagues did exactly the opposite to that, in fact, because they hid all MSF logos to avoid that they might be targeted. And they were very realistic about this because they were in danger of becoming targets. our means of transport. And when we ask them, why don't you make that your hospital, for example, is known, and even if it's been attacked, and they answered that if we do that, we're going to be attacked again. We are going to signal the fact, in fact, that we are again the target if we put the name of the hospital, for example, out in front, and at risk of being bombarded by the regime. And so they even wanted to hide the fact for anything that might lead to their being a target. And for them, in short term, the scenes in Homs, Baba Ammar, and the western part of the Arguta plain around Damascus, and then in East Ruta, in these four situations, they created an image or picture of what was the policy of the regime. First of all, for them, the military tactics of the regime were the headquarters. And secondly, the citizens of the people were targeted as well by the bombing the markets, schools, and bakery shops. Everything was used to be able to attack the population. And thirdly, the targeting of the professional health givers. And fourthly, the fact of chasing away inhabitants from places where they lived previously. There was an enormous amount of displacement of the forced displacement of the civilian population, and to prevent them from coming back to their home areas. And the fifth place, all of this violence against the civilians, it was used by using gas, especially in 2013, in attacking the city near Damascus. So now I want to say something about Hakim Khaldi's paper, the situation experienced by the doctors of the coalition and ourselves in these zones which were still not in the government's hands. In these areas, we couldn't remain very long as foreigners in these areas. First of all, because we didn't want to admit it, but among the military groups that control these areas, they are not always very easy or guarantee the situation of the civilian population and the humanitarian workers trying to care for them. But nonetheless, we can say, despite the difficulties we experience, even with groups which were fairly radical, I'm thinking about organizations by Jabhat al-Nusra and Aran Sham, the medical, political, religious organizations which have a certain allegiance to Al-Qaeda. But we still managed to reach agreements with some of these groups to work in at least a fairly effective way while co-inhabiting with them and also cooperating medically with them. Up to a certain point for the expats up until about the beginning of 2014. It's 3 years now that we managed to co-inhabit with these groups and organize medical care with them. Hakim didn't just stuck with the geopolitical situation in these areas which were out of the government's control, but he also talked about the operations when we talk about the northeast of Syria, that a space controlled militarily and politically and socially by the Kurds, the PKK. But that led to a fairly bitter experience for us, because despite the good image that PKK enjoys beyond the Syrian borders, particularly in France, But we ran up to, as Hakim describes, the sectarianism of the PKK and the parts of Syria they controlled, but they don't talk much about the Arab population that lives in these areas. The funds were misappropriated in favor of the Kurds, the PKK. And to help the Kurdish, and there wasn't a lot of tolerance. There wasn't a lot of tolerance toward anybody outside of their community, and these experiences accumulated with the attack in June of 2017 in Raqqa by the Kurdish forces, supported by the international coalition that was formed against the Islamic State. When they occupied Raqqa, and we then observed an offensive where no wounded people were able to get out of the city, as opposed to other battles, final battles against the Islamic State. We found it impossible to get the wounded out. Even though they worked at the Kobani hospital, we were unable to welcome the casualties from Raqqa. And so a population living in Raqqa were crushed under the bombing by the international coalition as well as the Islamic State and the Kurds. And we were unable to give them care, and we treated the men and were taken as presumed members of the Islamic State when Raqqa fell. For the combatants of the Islamic State, there was an agreement that enabled them to, a number of them, to get out of the town safe and sound from the battle, but to reach territories which were already controlled by the Islamic State. Whereas, but there was no offer of this kind was made to the civilian population. Another situation that we as foreigners encountered in Syria was to try to work with in the areas controlled by the Islamic State. And there also it was possible for a while, to our great surprise. But when the Islamic State occupied certain areas, especially the major cities, it was in their interest not to have the medical situation in these cities collapse right away, which allowed us to work in these areas, with the consequence that there was a disappearance of any possibility of hospital activities, consequently. We worked in a completely surrealistic way in this world that was controlled by the Islamic State, but that stopped when the word that they had kidnapped 5 of our colleagues from MSF Belgium in the Idlib governorate. And what Hakim describes very well also in the papers, there were several negotiations, several attempts to negotiate with Damascus to be able to offer our help to the health institutions run by the government. We tried every kind of approach to try and receive permission. We approached the government either directly by its representatives in Geneva. We sent South African diplomats to carry our messages, to show that we were not uniquely a Western organization, and we also asked the intercession of Russia to be able to discuss with Bashar al-Assad's regime. But each time there were promises which were not held. But we also have to add, in any case, the regime was not expecting anything of us because 84% of the international aid from the UN and other organizations, or the aid delivered by the Red Cross movement, 84% was absorbed by the government and its institutions, and the Arab Red Crescent, for example, as well. And so we haven't any regrets on that subject because the government organization was completely against us. The final paper, which I'm going to very briefly complete, is written by at Manchester University, Sophie Roborgh, who focused on the attacks against the personnel and the health facilities, and she paid particular attention to the data. And so for analytical purposes, also advocacy purposes. From the analytical point of view, she remarked that on the databases that she had access to, it's very difficult to understand what an attack is. Now, when we say that, is it something, are these acts which are aiming at health facilities with a view to decimating them? Or do we talk about the consequences of the general attacks, which are not specifically health facilities, but against districts of cities which were flattened by bombs and were subject to the same kind of bombing, and it's hard to tell if that was a priority or not. Another difficulty with the analytical processing in the databases concerns the process of checking. What do we record as an attack? Something which was seen directly, or did we hear about it? Was it followed by a direct eyewitness? Do we have to be on site to be able to bear witness to what we see? Or all these questions of limitations, working, changing, and modifying the analysis that we can carry out. And the databases, according to the players that Sophie interviewed, they serve for advocacy, but also for analysis. And this bolsters the analytical part of her paper, because the field teams do not want their training to serve as part of the advocacy, because by their idea, because they might be exposed to reprisals once their reports are read by the other side. There was a limit of advocacy due to the fact that the aid organizations and human rights organizations who intervene, whether they're national or international, run up against their teams in the field who wish to remain quiet, and just carry out their work as a guarantee of their protection. The use of the data for the activities rolled out produce the same distortionate effects that you can imagine in humanitarian situations where we intervene, where our partners, when they decide to speak publicly, that is, that they are eyewitness accounts and represent well, and this work has to be done at the expense of the attitudes of the field teams.
Now, the very last problem with these advocacy testimonies, as it were, as they are called, is, and it's probably due to the social media, it's the fact that all these organization members do have a private life on Facebook or Twitter, and in the evening, when they are done with their work, they explain what goes on in their organization, what affected their organization during the day, without any supervision from the organization's management. Finally, and I leave it there, this is the last point Sophie focuses on. It's got to do with the testimonies that can be used before the courts for criminal justice. Now, Sophie explains that law, the legal system, has become a key element in the observational process. And if some 10 attacks can be documented, well, it's enough for the courts, for the legal advisors, and even if some hundreds of attacks have been perpetrated, well, it may not be that relevant from the legal point of view or that useful from the legal point of view, so much so that some of these attacks are going to be overlooked, or serious incidents that can't be properly documented or as thoroughly documented won't be taken before the courts. So Sophie Roborgh tells us that we have to discriminate between the different types of data that is collected. Data collected for analysis, and here we need to focus on the targeted attacks and discriminate between these sort of targeted attacks and the untargeted or unplanned attacks. And legally speaking, she says that you can't just use the same sets of data to do so. And I'm very sorry, because this paper is so much more interesting than what I've been telling you. But just to leave it there, I just want to say, by way of conclusion, that in Iraq and in Syria, as of 2011, have given rise to news and breaking news with body counts, with the number of deaths almost transmitted or communicated live. And it was a first in mankind's history. Legitimate or illegitimate military casualties and fatalities have never been reported as regularly and as directly as during these two wars. This is quite remarkable. And I think you need to understand that it by no means did it curtail the level of violence, and more particularly for the Syrian civil war. Even knowing that the civilian populations were targeted and hunted and were left to die of hunger, well, even knowing exactly how many people were dying every day, well, it had no impact whatsoever on the level of violence that was exerted against these populations. Thank you, Jean-Hervé. Now, we've already seen that for Syria, how the work of 3 relief actors and also a researcher could help us to set up the scene and could help us to flesh out the picture. And this is what we attempted to do in our book. you may wonder how people coming from so different backgrounds, human rights activists, academics, journalists, and humanitarians, doctors could work together for this book in order to give a clearer picture of what was going on in the field. We could also have turned to a legal people, because legal advisors and lawyers also look into these situations. But you see, it would have been a bright idea, because all of us, we perform investigations. All of us are investigators. We are investigators in order to know better what went on, and in order to better rescue these people or save them. And also, we investigate in order to be able to judge. So you see, this diversity of backgrounds can be understood, and I'd like to explain to you how it can be organized. Well, of course, the aims of the investigations do condition by far how these different stakeholders take action. Of course, humanitarians, human rights activists have to identify very quickly the information they need. This information is going to help them to guide their actions, and journalists also have to take action very quickly. Speed is of the essence for them. But it's different for academics. For us academics, we can take our time to gather information and to put them in order. And of course, this is in the ideal world, because we always complain, academics complain that they never have enough time, either because they don't have enough money, the funding is not enough, or it's because they have to produce the work more quickly than they had planned. I also want to say that these are fields that are dangerous, very difficult to access, with traumatized populations where infrastructure is derelict or destroyed. And of course, these are constraints for all of us. And it demands of us to adapt ourselves. And it means also that we need to tap into different types of sources and to conduct different types of investigations. Jean-Hervé told us about that. You see, the internet, the web watch, and the social media can be of great help. Other researchers have to turn to sources in another country because they can't get access to the place where violence takes place. In Rwanda, Liane Fuji, this academic I will mention again, had very limited funds, and she could work only for a few months with just one interpreter. So she went at this, she dealt with it in a very old-fashioned way. She conducted an ethnographic investigation. She got in touch with people whom she could identify, about whose networks she could be informed. Conversely, human rights activists who published a book that has become a Bible on Rwanda entitled "No Witnesses Should Survive." These people got access to communal and prefectural archives, so written documents, and they could also, in parallel, conduct ethnographic investigations because they could have some help in order to conduct these investigations. Another researcher, Bert Engeler, who could work in Rwanda on the Guichaoua, these trials that went on between 2005 and 2012, he could witness 1,917 trials concerning 2,753 individuals. So this was a large-scale study, and he spent several years witnessing these trials. So you see in this book that several types of field investigations that take place, and different types of investigations and investigation modalities are described, such as the ones conducted by Marc Lepape. He used the hearings transcriptions of the International Criminal Court to reconstruct the path to violence of one of the Congolese war chiefs. So you could say it's like a jigsaw, because our aims are different for all of us, but also because the type of investigations that were conducted are also different. However, the methodology of the book is consistent, and it's one of its strengths, because all the chapters in the book describe how investigations took place, and these are processual process studies with a clear identification of the different players at stake, and the practices are also very precisely described. So everything is consistent from this regard, and this is what explains how we could we could write this book together. Now, other countries were the focus of these investigations, of this research. I won't mention Syria because Jean-Hervé told you about it. Now, contrary to Syria, there are no papers dedicated to humanitarian actions in the eastern part of Congo and in Rwanda. Well, it's because there are already books on these issues with the hunting down and the massacres of Hutu refugees between 1996 and 1997. With regard to Congo, we wanted to highlight more recent situations. However, we are also with MSF because we worked with Justin Brabant, a journalist, and also an academic, Myfny James. Justin Brabant is well known for her papers and her book on the Kivu, and she's a war journalist, though, of course, these wars are civil wars. And Justin Brabant tries to see what can influence the work of journalists in the field, like diplomats or the diplomatic take on what goes on, because journalists in the field meets with diplomats and they ask diplomats about their take on the situation. Or you meet legal advisors or people who carry out investigations for international courts. And of course, this gives her a wealth of information, she says, and she can also rely on field information. But she she fears that it could introduce a bias in her analysis of the situation. In this book, she explains much more precisely, in much more detail, what could be the danger, what could be the risk for reporters, for journalists, when they are too close to humanitarian organizations, and more particularly MSF in her case. You see, when you are a journalist and you're for the first time in the field, or this is a field maybe you don't know so well, with just some information from your colleagues who maybe already had an assignment in the country. So, of course, turning to MSF is quite natural, and MSF usually is well embedded in the region, and of course, MSF people may have their families in the region and may tell her a lot of things. And it's also a way to tap into MSF's archives and memories and networks. However, it's also a risk of having a bias. For instance, MSF has conducted a lot of investigations on sexual violence in North Kivu, but there are many other things that you could say about North Kivu. So how can you stay independent as a war reporter while being embedded with MSF? Maybe we will have the opportunity to revisit this issue later on during the discussion. So as she puts it, there's always a risk of starting to talk, quote unquote, MSF. The researcher is my Fanwy James, and she's from Wales, and she carried out an ethnographic investigation, field investigation in North Kivu, focusing on MSF. And she tried to understand what's the difficult situation for humanitarian Congolese humanitarians when it comes to the absolute need of remaining neutral for MSF. And of course, these people can't just say that they are independent or absolutely neutral, because they live in the country and they have their families, and they have, of course, to comply at the same time with MSF's neutrality principle. And I want to quote James. Now, humanitarians just neglect the fact or overlook the fact that it's not always possible for everybody to remain neutral. Not everyone can sing to the tune of MSF and be neutral. And of course, the organization is aware of the problem, and MSF has tried to solve the problem by assigning work in a different way, like having the local staff or the national staff in charge of the medical work, whereas the expats coming from abroad are here to guarantee, as it were, MSF's neutrality. So there's a sort of division of work here, which is not as explicit as that, but which nonetheless takes place. And this is really a source of inequality, and James shows it very clearly for North Kivu. And by the way, this is a piece of work that had been identified by other people within MSF, because I think that her work was translated in Arabic. So you see, the journalists and this researcher have reconstructed the investigation process in this region with armed conflicts, and the sociologist, on the other hand, Marc Le Pape, decided to tell the story of one of the warlords, Bosco Nataga, who's been tried by the ICC. And Justine Brabant had also reported on less powerful warlords, because it's also another way to report on the decades of violence in this region. Now, Rwanda, and I want to speed up for the sake of time. Now, Rwanda corresponds to half of our book, 6 chapters out of 12. It's because the symposium took place 25 years after the genocide of Tutsis, and this is why the Rwanda Day was also a commemoration as well as a piece of research. With the exception of just one author, Nicolas Mariot, all authors investigated and published on the genocide. So 25 years down the road, they sort of draw their conclusions on the work that has been carried out for on Rwanda and the history of Rwanda. And this is probably why these authors have given priority to epistemological or methodological approach. I don't want to give you too many details, but I just want to highlight the papers that share common problematics. Timothy Longman and Scott Strauss, both of them Americans, I think they are very complementary. Timothy Longman is the one who has written a very crucial book entitled "No Witnesses Should Survive." It is really a crucial piece of work and a seminal work. And so Timothy wondered whether this book was still relevant today or could be still considered as relevant or acceptable. So he says, Timothy says that, well, 20 years later, of course, many researches have taken place, but the book is still valid. However, there are 2 points that he highlights. And by the way, this is also the 2 points that led to controversies. The first point, this book argued that there had been a planning of the genocide well ahead of 1994. Well, this is an assumption that was questioned by many researchers. And the second point has got to do with the violence committed by the RPF against the civil populations, and that were not sufficiently dealt with and not taken into account as being the outcome of a political intent. Most of the time they are presented as people taking revenge in the field, whereas for other researchers, they think that there is a political will at play. And this is exactly this point of a political will that is at the center of the paper written by Scott Strauss. He published a very important book in 2006, The Order of Genocide. In this book, Scott Strauss calls into question the academic report on mass violence in Rwanda since 1990. And he carries out a very thorough criticism, and he says that the academics didn't really dealt with the violence that were perpetrated against Hutus, and that had taken place regularly between 1990 and today. And he says so because this violence was identified and reported on by non-governmental organizations, but this sort of research is totally forbidden in Rwanda. And because this sort of investigation into this form of violence, well, because it's forbidden, of course, it can open the door to conspiracy theories and the thesis of the double genocide. So you see, it's very important to be able to see it's very important to note that in the absence of academic research, the door is open to conspiracy theories. And these 2 authors, I think, are very complementary. 2 other authors are also complementary in my view. Nicolas Mariot, he didn't, and myself. Nicolas Mariot didn't go to Rwanda. And here I want again to stress the contribution from Leanne Fuji, a Canadian researcher. She died of influenza in 2018, and all of us were shocked. How is it possible to die of influenza in 2018? Well, all of us revisited this opinion not too long afterwards. So I presented, she was due to take part in this book, but obviously could not, so I presented her work. Nicolas Mariot has got a very good knowledge of the academic work on Rwanda and on the Shoah, and he says that there are two types of, or two modalities of research and thought. Firstly, an approach that puts at the forefront the racism and the racist approach and the will to eliminate and eradicate, and another approach that doesn't really look at this hatred, but which does give priority to the observation of groups in the field, and with a accuracy both in time and space, and whose stakeholders are well known. He's been able to show that in Rwanda, in the case of Rwanda, it's the processual approach that has been privileged, which has been preferred over the culturalist approach, which does exist, but to a lesser extent. And the processual or situational approach is very common among Anglo-Saxon academics. And Lee and Fuji gives us a very good example of this. And this is why Nicolas Mariot's paper and mine really go hand in hand. And more particularly, my presentation of Lee and Fuji's work, because I think it does show in detail what Nicolas Mariot calls the processual study. Finally, two authors on justice, the sociologist André Guichaoua. He was an expert with the ICTR, and he offers a review of the judicial policy in Rwanda in a historical perspective, and he gives us the number of trials, of convictions, of indictments, extraditions, which is quite unheard of. The anthropologist Bert and Gilleray, who conducted a very lengthy investigation in the Gacaca courts, highlights the ambivalence, the ambiguities among the population with regard to, quote unquote, the truth of the testimonies during the trials. And the chapter he contributed to in the book is was not published in his thesis, and he highlights the interactions between the victims and the perpetrators during hearings. Now, the truths called for by the judges, by the magistrates, are based on evidence, so that magistrates can say, well, this person is guilty because he was seen at this time and in this place. And there's also truth with a capital T, political truth, as it were, and the efficient truth. So this truth with a capital T means that some things are going to be put at the forefront and others are going to be set aside, but everybody knows. And there's also what he calls the effective truth, the fact that you can say some or explain some of these things, but just set aside others because it would be detrimental to the sort of truth you want to get across. And as an anthropologist, of course, who knows the country very well, he's in the best position to explain to us all this. And there's also moral truth. and its meaning, which in fact is based on the social world and the cultural world in Rwanda. And there's also the noble, this is the noble truth that comes from the heart. And it may not be the one that you can hear during a trial. It can be also non-verbal attitudes of witnesses during the trial. And this is what Bert explains in the book. Now, I tried to summarize all this, and I think it's best now to open the floor to discussions.
Just to end, this whole story, like for Syria as well, it's still a very hot topic. And MSF obviously has very recent episodes that would show how hot the situation is. Now, concerning Rwanda, even though it is a matter of an assessment, I had to dealt with Refi, who did an interview with me about this book. And there were a lot of interviews, and after 4 minutes, and they titled it, at last the university people are able to work on the history of Rwanda. And I protested a little bit, it seemed, but for 25 minutes I didn't only talk about that. And the journalist responded, yes, of course, but it's the most important thing in the book. That is, the journalists of the RFI have another vision, and they think their point of view is what counts. Concerning Kivu, we spoke about what happened with Saint-Exupéry, with the episodes that occurred between 1996 and 1997, and the situation is still as hot as it ever was to this very day. So thank you, Claudine. But perhaps I want to react to what has just been said about the crimes by the FPR, which is a reality for MSF, because after the publication of the book by Patrick Saint-Exupéry, a book which wanted to be an investigation in the allegations of a double genocide, but perhaps more broadly an enterprise of the negation of the proof of the massacre by the Rwandan forces and their Congolese allies. And this is a new controversy, and I think it's interesting to underline when we are getting interested in our reactions and to the aid we can offer. I'd like to remind you of the fact that you have a head of state, Kagame, who has been in power for over 25 years and counts on remaining in power for a long time. Presents himself as a kind of a delegate of the victims of the genocide of the Tutsis, but in capital letters, the genocide with a capital G. But the reality of Kagame's reality it's much more debatable, but it isn't discussed. But I just want to stress the fact that the president of Rwanda is one of the greatest killers in the African continent. There's Issa and Ebre, Ouya Bashir, to only talk about certain characters, but nobody wants to be seen avec Bashir or Debre. But in any case, they do whatever they can not to be seen with these known killers. And it's an exception which I find fairly interesting and worth stressing. And the controversy in all this are people already involved in this, the African researchers or others. But this controversy is very old at MSF, and has led us to process as this author as a falsifier. The word was weighed and perfectly well chosen as an accusation. And this makes it enables us to be used as a tool in this controversy. And those who are interested in that, I can recommend the reading of the Saint-Exupéry book. And so much for my personal commentary, but if you have anything to contribute, please don't hesitate now. Thank you for the presentations. So thank you for the presentations. I have a kind of a basic question. The first is, did you have to make a choice in the field? Because there is a plethora of possibilities in the field, and did you have to choose between one or the other? Were you interested in the typology of the violence in these three countries? And the anthropological studies. And the second question I have, Jean-Hervé, you talked, it was very interesting about the deaths, and when in your paper, when there's a quantification on the daily deaths in the field, and so the remark I want to make is that we have no notion of the deaths. I'm thinking about Yemen for several years, but it doesn't mean that there was any less violence. I remember the Yemeni context about 5 years ago. We had 10,000 civilian deaths in 2016 to 2019. For 3 years, these 10,000 deaths were not put forth, and the violence didn't diminish at all. But we realized in the end that this challenge of the number of deaths was used in particular in the communications by various players. And my third question to Jean-Hervé, the quantification of deaths was not mitigated, but in this Syrian context in particular, did it help us to judge today? What can we judge today? And what could we have judged and what should we judge based on the data from the field in the Syrian context as we know it today? So I can answer to your first question. In fact, in the beginning, we thought about organizing a symposium on Rwanda and only on Rwanda with Jean-Hervé. But we also wanted to that it's not just MSF on its own that carry out this symposium. And so we addressed the MSF Fondation. And so these two institutions are at the origins of this symposium and the book. And Michel Everkak, who was at the time of president of Message, asked that that Syria be included in the discussion. And then another researcher from the Message, the Congos had to be treated. The Rwanda and the Congo didn't pose any problems for us, because there were things which were happening all the time between one country and the other, and that's how it occurred. And so it was a choice made by these two institutions, MSF and the Message. And so the answer to your other questions, I'll leave to Jean-Hervé. Thank you, Quentin. Question from Jean-François. The counting of the victims by MSF on Syria didn't reach a minimal level of quality and coverage to enable us, as Sophie said, to do an analysis. And for the others, it's rather a matter of the information that comes from the doctor has been appointed to look into the medical aspect of this, with the photos of 11,000 Syrians who were tortured by the regime. And through that, and from his professional training and his professional task, and he had elements of proof with the reports from NGOs, which are very interesting to understand the war dynamic and to be able to draw conclusions from that, from these activities. But you are very well aware of their importance, and they have a value which they are not, even though they're not complete portfolios or very big in the process of investigation. So I don't know if I've answered your question sufficiently. For carrying on from what you've just said, Sophie Roborgh advises us in the book to separate the databases according to the why. Can you give us some more details about that? It's advice which she has given us. I wasn't surprised by this advice because in our profession, it's something which we do quite often. That is, building a definition of cases, an attack defined by its a local siege, followed by a check verified by one or two witnesses who were on site, and that it hasn't just been reported to us by a third party, but they were not eyewitnesses to the event itself. And so to do case definitions is something which we do almost systematically, and in the background there is a sort of a subjective side to it, which means that we have to accept and to number the characteristics of the disaster to build case definitions today. In our profession, since we want to eradicate the measles, we define it in a very broad manner as all clinical state as defined by a clinician working in the Congo in the early 2010s. And so any John Doe kind of a clinician is going to report on the measles because concerning this disease, we have a particular goal, that a definition which embodies the whole of the measles. And it's kind of the same thing when we talk about wars. We've defined what we call the death, that is to serve these goals of recognition, but not just that. But there's no real case definition which is going to be neutral or objective in our professional activities. I wonder if that answers your question. Nicolas? A question about the notion of extreme violence. And I'm wondering, with all the elements which you have reported on, there are characteristics of the situations you process which don't necessarily seem to have to do with extreme violence. I'm thinking, for example, of the tension around the imperative of neutrality. It may be that It may be relevant in fighting situations which are not necessarily extreme. On the other hand, what you say about the need to hide the health teams themselves, perhaps that leads to an extreme level of violence. And could you give greater detail what you mean by extreme violence, and how does that refer back to the analysis of what you're talking about in the book? And in relation to what other kind of violence we might be able to compare the extreme violence of what you're talking about in the book. I think if you look at Syria, we had never encountered such systematic attacks against medical vehicles, against the medical staff, and also the health facilities. If I add to that the spaces temporarily controlled by the Islamic State and the use of this organization of violence, in the Syrian context, I mention the documents that report on the violence in the prisons of the regime, and if we add all that up, I am not giving primacy of place to any war, but we in our profession, we are working in exceptional situations. I work very briefly in Syria in a zone controlled by the Islamic State, and that to me was a particular experience, and I defined it as extreme. And Claudine working in the genocide in Rwanda, it's the same thing. You have a political authority decides to kill everybody in an ethnic group and has the means to carry it out in such a short amount of time and on that scale. I think in history, in an historic context, you can find examples as strong in excessive violence, but in the contemporary world, there are things we can say about the Congo. Between 1996 and 1997, the tracking of the Rwandan refugees by the PFR was genuinely related with the MSF's documents, and here it's a matter of trying to kill everything they can kill. And the qualification as extreme, I think, is well deserved. But in present-day Kivu, as reported in part of the book, it's the civil war, which are constant with warlords, with killings, which are more or less large. It's not like in Syria or in the south of Rwanda. But Rony often refers to the Congolese experience, that are our teams, humanitarian teams, the ICRC and the UNHCR and MSF, and it's UNHCR which talked about some of these situations. And so we were direct witnesses to the crimes, and with the radio and the liaison officers, Congolese or Rwandais, warned the squads of killers who came at the end of the day to find the refugees we talked about in the history of MSF. The fact that MSF's actions also serves to get people killed, indirectly, not deliberately, of course, but we have to do it because the ICRC insisted with the UNHCR and also with MSF that they have to render accounts of what they saw happen. And so we were living in kind of denial of the information that nonetheless it possessed in part, and decided to stop doing that. And that's where we see, when organizations like ours, the obsession we have to remain operational at whatever cost. And sometimes it's limitless. And so it's a topic of discussion among ourselves to be able to get these operations to stop. Military operations, which Claudine mentioned, kills people. And that for us, it was an experience, an extreme experience, if I may. In the present situation is slightly different, but nonetheless, as Mark can talk about it more, the situation in North Kivu is of an extraordinary violence against the civilian population. In the case of the warlord, and this I saw this over 5 years in the region called Ituri, and the warlord we worked with, which were systematic massacres during the whole period. And this occurred in the Ituri area of Congo, and it continued in North Kivu for years. The extreme in all that is the repetition and the localized massacres for starting in the 1910s to the present day. And there were numbers of people killed every day in Ituri, right up to the present day. And it's the constant existence of massacres in Ituri which leads us to qualify it as extreme. If you don't want to call it extreme, it certainly is a very particular situation. Claudine, could you explain how the processual analysis helps us get closer to the truth? And my second question, are these various players, the journalists and researchers, collaborate more easily in writing a work in comparison to the way they work in the field when they do an investigation? And when they're acting in the field, how does it vary, the work when they get together to be able to write a work as you have produced with this new book? Concerning the study of cruelty, the journalist was well defended by the refugees. There was a posthumous book which was published afterwards where compared, she wanted to study the practice of cruelty as she was able to find in Rwanda when she did her field research, and she also went to Serbia to look at what were the practices in the Serb camps, prisoner of war camps, but always in a very localized sense, concerning only a small group of people who knew one another. And she also studied lynching in the United States in the early 20th century. And so what she tried to show in both cases is that indeed the practices of cruelty can only be understood by a group, like in Rwanda, the killer groups, the militias. And she shows that there's a certain grading. The first days they burn houses, and they kill directly anybody who tries to defend themselves. And gradually, little by little, people, the leaders, are set up. And it's a matter. It's a kind of a functionalist approach. It's a matter of showing that more and more that they are members of the group, because it's very dangerous to be outside of the group, and gradually things grow bigger, and the cruelty grows more extreme, and the cruel acts are increased. And that doesn't mean that everybody demonstrates themselves as being cruel, but certain people are increase their cruelty. And these are public acts, in fact, and all the more cruel. One of the things which is most stupefying in Rwanda is that the cruelty were public acts, and systematically. And the worst kind of cruelties, forcing people who are trying to get away, were forced to remain and watch the cruelty. And so a lot remains to be done to analyze the cruelty that occurred in Rwanda. But indeed, I think that this kind of maliciousness, which is so precise, is certainly more effective to enable to understand what happened than broader analyses that turn around hatred and the definition of the enemy. So I said that if somebody asked me, I want to give a justification of Sophie Roborgh, how not to talk about MSF. I wanted to see if there were researchers on site, and she very carefully added that the trust which is established with the journalist, I would rather go see with them what's going on in the area. Justine Brabant. Before closing down the micros and invite you to have a drink afterwards, we can always continue our discussions. But I would also like to say a few things about the episode that Jean-Hervé talked about shortly before. That is, of course, the humanitarian workers used as fixers or as guards of the Rwandan army or the Rwandan militias. Not to resume the story, but to stress the fact that perhaps the event of the history of humanitarian workers is to repeat humanitarian disasters. We talk about humanitarian crises. Every week we see the worst examples of humanitarian abuses in Afghanistan. Rather than talking about a famine or a war or the number of refugees, we talk in these terms. I remind you that the word humanitarian crisis was used for the first time, I think, in the June 22nd resolution allowing the rollout of the turquoise operations, and they used that formula to not talk about genocide in Rwanda. In other words, we use humanitarian crisis to hide a reality. And today we're talking about it as if to reveal something. So this work of dissimulation is still accomplished. But when you have a humanitarian disaster, it deserves its name. That was talked about by Jean-Hervé. And the use, when we talk about humanitarian history, is to do visits by the ICRC, visits to Nazi camps, an event which justified the témoignage and denunciation as opposed to silence and complicity with the Nazi regime. But despite all the criticisms we might level to the ICRC, but it's not the visit to the camps, but it's the appointments in the camps. And we have studied that for a long time through the Swiss historian's book, whose name escapes me at the moment. And the ICRC cannot be held responsible of the omerta which reigned in the Nazi camps during the Second World War. Even the fact that they had accepted so-called the Nazification of the camps before the war. On the other hand, the humanitarian organizations which had been used like hunting dogs by the killers in 1987, 1996, 1997, as Jean-Hervé reminded us, but it happened at a time when was revealed, and the horror of the situation didn't attract everybody. Actually, the alternative beyond the principles, humanitarian principles, launched to the aid givers with victims seems strong and capable of anesthetize the trust, the general trust of the pandemic, and with extremely vivid things to be able to convince people concerned that if they continued, they would be co-responsible for the death of hundreds or thousands of people. It's an assertion to think about the limits of humanitarian action. It's possible to turn against the objectives that are pursued, but it seems more important than this fake mentioning of history, which delegated by the Red Cross by distributing sandwiches who are going to be thrown into gas chambers or in the crematoriums. That is a horrible story, a fairy tale, which is only kind of a military propaganda, and the difficult reality that happened in the Congo should make us reflect on what we could call the limits of humanitarian action, which have to do with the limitations of humanitarian action that we are faced with every day in the field. And so there you have it. No regrets. No regrets for closing the meeting now. Now, please go next door for a drink. And thank you very much to the authors of the work.